In this chapter we will look into the currents, because the tides are not only taking you up and down, it also results in the water flowing from high water to low water. So the water flows and you can take advantage of it. You have to take them into consideration sometimes. And they do nasty things if the wind and tide are going opposite directions. You have wind over tide, and that's something that you have to be aware of and maybe avoid. So follow me here about the currents.
The currents. Well, the currents are impressive. This is Scotland, and it's actually the Corrie Wrekin we sailed through. And this is around Shetland, going around Sombro Head. It can be very uncomfortable, especially if you have wind over tide. And wind over tide is something that you should be very careful about. So currents are important to take into consideration. Not only that you want to be sailing faster, but also if you compare it with the wind, so you don't have any uncomfortable overfalls and waves. And if you use an app here, it is a bit difficult because the overview is very often missing in the apps, and it's only for a few days in advance again if you don't pay. And I think it shows you the current in a specific time, yes. In which direction, yes, that's fair enough. If you want to know at that time what's the current doing. But I want to have an overview for planning purposes. And that's why I think an app is not necessary for the current. The direction over the tidal period, so that's from one low water over high water to next low water, that is the 12 hours there. It's always the same. So the currents are always doing the same thing. It's only varies in strength. So you want to know in which direction the current goes, look at the overview charts, and then they vary in strength, and that depends on the range of the day. That's why you have to calculate the range. Okay, let's look at the IMRE Tidal Planner, because you have that. You click on that, and you then go over and change for tides. And here you have the tide for a certain day. Well, go back to some day, 12th of June, for instance, which was interesting. And then we look at the tides here, and we see in the English channel how they go forward and backward by us pulling or pushing the button plus or minus an hour. But it doesn't give you the overview so nicely. And if you look at iBoat by Time Zero, it's also an app, so you can click on that one, and then same thing. You see the more orange, the stronger it is, and you can play forward. But it's like seeing a movie, and you see how it turns to the right and then it turns to the left. Yes, but which time should we go? Okay, that is usable, but I would like to show how easy it is to use a nice paper chart out of the reeds. Look at the reeds, because the good news is that it's always the same. It's just the time varies according to the high water in Dover. So you have to know what time is high water in Dover, and that's one of these pictures, and then you go forward and backward and compare. This is the Channel Islands, which are quite interesting. So if you zoom in one of these pages, this one, high water, so you can see that this is how it looks when it is high water in Dover. This picture is valid for high water. Dover isn't even on this picture. It doesn't matter. When Dover has high water, this is how it looks here around Jersey and Guernsey and Alderney. Don't think that it has anything to do with the high water you might experience if you might be in St. Peter Port in Guernsey right now, because tides couldn't care less where you are. It doesn't care what high water you have. This picture is valid for everyone, and irrespectively if they are in Dover or Helgoland or Dublin or wherever, this picture is valid when Dover has high water. So when does Dover have high water? Well, you look up in the reeds, of course. So you look up Dover. Here is the reeds, and you see that high water is at 12:16, and you have 7 meters there. So 12:16. All right, so you write 12:16 in this box. This box is valid at 12:16. It's really easy then to add 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours here, 4, 5, 6 hours after high water, and at 18:06, 6 hours later, that's about low water. So how does it continue after 18:06? Well, there isn't any for the next box, so you have to pick the next high water, and the next high water is at 0039, as you can see, and then you count backwards from that. So 0039, 2339, 2239, and so on until 1939. So after the picture on the bottom right corner, 18:06, follow the top left picture, 1939. Well, it's not an hour, it's an hour and 25 minutes later. Do you see that? Why isn't it an hour and 1 hour and 25 minutes later? Well, if you looked at the video before, the time of high water is always the next day about 50 minutes later. And since you have 2 high waters per day, then it's about 25 minutes from one high water to another high water, approximately. But it shows here that from one high water to next high water, it is about 25 minutes later, and that's why the step from bottom right to top left is not 1 hour, but 1 hour and 25 minutes. So these pictures are what is valid on this day. You look at the time and you see which picture is valid. So what do we want to know? Well, let's assume we want to sail here about 15:16. That's our plan, to sail here in this area. So let's zoom in this and see. This is the chart at 15:16. Now 15:16, which is 3 hours after high water Dover, this picture is valid by definition from half an hour before to half an hour after. So from any time between 14:46 and 15:46 on the 12th of September, you should use this chart. So what does it mean? Well, it shows the direction of the current. That's rather logical, I think. So if you are sailing here around in the ordinary races, you can see that the arrow is pointing, so you have the current pushing you that way. But how much is it pushing you that way? Is it much or not so much? Do you have to consider that if you have wind over tide, or can you motor against it? Because sometimes the currents you can't care less. The thicker ones are a bit stronger, and the thinner arrows are a bit weaker. But there is a number there to give you more accuracy. So let's copy this number, 41,73. And that is something that is not very obvious to understand what it means. Well, irrespectively of if it's neap or spring or range or whatever, this is the direction 3 hours after high water, and the direction is always the same. That's good. But then you have the 41,73. Don't kill the messenger when I explain this, because I can't help that they have intended it to do it the following way. So what they want to tell you is the 41 means it's 4.1 knots at mean neap and 7.3 knots at mean spring. That's a quite strong current. That's what it says. But it says mean neap. It can very much be stronger or weaker if your current spring is even beyond the mean spring. Remember from the first video, it alternates up and down, and then you have a mean spring and a mean neap. So the red one for mean neap and this for mean spring. But what you must not forget is that you have a range of today which can be anything. It can even be bigger than this. So let's look how it is today. What is the range on the 12th of September? So let's look at the range at 12th of September, and we do that with Leon's templates. So that's where I have the currents. Remember my templates here, and this is where we do the current calculation. So the currents, the strength of the currents, they have to do with the ranges. So what we do, we write here 12th of September, and we have Dover as our standard port. Okay, so what were the times and heights? We look up Dover. We have already found out that the time of high water is 12:16, as you can remember, and the next one is 00:39. But we haven't taken the height into consideration. The 12th of September is a red day. 12th of September is a spring day. So, standard port is Dover. It has a little star. Just copy these numbers, what it says in the reads. And we don't need that now for height calculations like we did in Belle-Île, but we use the ranges. So the interesting thing is, what are the ranges of the day? So we wanted to be there at around 3 o'clock, remember, 15 hours. So we take the difference between 12:16 and 19:59, the range there, that is 7.1 meters and 0.5 meters. And the difference there is 6.6 meters. So that's a lot. So that 6.6 meter, that goes over to my right box. It goes over here, and you write 6.6 meters. Okay. And now we look at what is the mean range for neaps and the mean range for spring. And that, you can see that in the estimate current in that box in the left top side corner of that box. Read mean ranges next to tidal curve of standard port. So you take the standard port, you take the curve here, the tidal curve, and there it is. There they have written mean ranges, spring 6.0 meters and neap 3.2 meters. So these two figures, we copy here. The mean for neap is a range of 3.2 and the mean for spring is 6 meters. Dover is so important because many of these tidal atlases are made in respect of high water Dover. So it's so important with Dover, so they've made a little booklet. So if you buy the reads, you get a little booklet, and there you can read actually the tide range of today directly from that booklet. It's very practical. So just do that, and the mean ranges are always the same, and that's why I have written that in my little template there, that it's always 3.2 for neaps and always 6 meters for Dover. So if you have the situation that you want to have it for Dover, it's already pre-printed here in my little template. So what you do now is you look 6.6 meters of range. That's the difference between high water. That's why it says delta high water minus low water. The difference between high water and low water is 6.6 meters today. Where does that lie between 3.2 meters and 6.0 meters? Well, it looks actually as if it's outside the high figure. That's why I picked the 12th of September, because it's a quite interesting day. So on that current vector in purple here, you have two figures, remember? One is the speed, the current speed of the at mean neap, that's a lower figure, and the higher figure is the at mean spring. So we look which figure should we use? So no, here it is outside. It is actually quite a lot outside the 6 meters. So if we now go back and look at the 4.1 at mean neap and 7.3 at mean spring, we are between 4.1 and 7.3. We are here. We are outside the 7.3. So this on the 12th of September from 1445 to 1545, when this picture is valid, you have approximately 8 knots of current. Well, that's a lot. So don't motor against that. At least my boat doesn't do it. And it is cool. Yes, of course it's cool. So here I have a speed through water of 6.9 knots, but speed over ground is 13.2 knots. That is fun when you do the tidal calculations correctly, and maybe not as fun when you do it incorrectly and you have full throttle on the speed here, 8.1 knots through water, and you only make 0.99 knots through the water. So one thing is that it's cool and fun to do the calculations correctly, to go fast. But I've said it before, I say it again, wind over tide. My students, my participants, my sailing friends wanted to experience wind over tide, so we went through the needles in a wind over tide situation out of the Solent, westbound, and we knew that the wind was very, very weak actually, but we had to motor against the wind, and then we had the tide with us. So we were fast, but very uncomfortable. Look at that. So once outside of the Needles, as you could see, we could hoist the sail, fall off a little bit, and the waves were not as bad. So in this case, it was only a short period, and that's what I want to demonstrate to go through there. But it can be quite wobbly. I mean, look at this. This is typically tidal waves. These are drawn in the chart as races. You have this funny waves. They're really, really short and bumpy. This is on the south coast of England. And here we have the Cory Wrekin, no wind at all. That's why we went through there. Have a lot of races, and also these big eddies here that makes these whirls in the water. And there are touristic boats which go out in the rib and have fun playing the tides. All right, they've paid for it, but if you don't like it and your stomach isn't that good, be careful. Another typical place is that you are in Brunsbüttel, just exit from Kiel, the Nordostseekanal or the Kiel Canal, and you want to go to Cuxhaven. And you think that you are clever to go with the tide, but normally you have wind against you. If it's not perfect weather, you have west winds, and then you have these really, really, really short waves going up and down. So the period of these waves are very, very short. And that's why it's very good to look at that. Here I have windy, and look at the waves and tides. And the interesting part is not only the wave height, it's the period of the wave. So here on this picture you have the wave height. Blue is not so high waves, and the purple red ones there are higher waves. Okay, so you think here in the English Channel the waves are not as high, it's not a problem. But look at this, if you really look at that, it's animated. Here's very red. So I go to here to the Atlantic, it's 2.6 meters, but it has a period of 12 seconds. 2.6 meters, 12 seconds. That's not a problem because it's 12 seconds. But look into here. Now it's 2 meters, 7 seconds. It's much worse. And this is only 1.3 meters, but it has a period of 6 seconds. So I would expect that this is much more uncomfortable than in Galicia. And if you click on it, you can on windy see here where the waves are coming from, that you have two swells here, the orange swell and the green swell, and then you have the wind direction. So if they all come from one side, at least you don't have a lot of waves coming from all sorts of directions. So please consider the direction of the wind and current to avoid wind over tide situations. And another good thing is to check on the warnings on the charts. So here we have Portland Bill. Portland Bill, they have these little wave symbols, and they are actually where they are. So it's quite impressive that they can be there, and you can be completely without waves just next to them. You can even go inside sometimes. I was in really heavy waves there, and there was a little fishing boat sitting just next to us fishing in no waves at all. It looks approximately like this. So here where we are, there are no waves, and over there's a standing wave. And standing wave mean that it doesn't move. It's like a waterfall over there. So that's why you need to go a nice around there. So check the warnings in the chart. And then what is really, really good, that there are software on the market doing that. The comfort factor. Predict Wind has as a feature, you put in your data of your boat and the direction you want to go, and then it gives you calculates the wind waves, the primary swell and the secondary swell, and even the tertiary swell, and it looks at the roll, the vertical acceleration and the slamming, and then it gives you warnings for comfort. And this is a fantastic feature. I use it for when I do a passage plan and use computer models, just to check if how the comforts will be. So Predict Wind has a comfort factor, but of course it's not the same for all boats. If the boats are very flat bottomed and a key and a short keel, it's very quickly getting very uncomfortable. The traditional boats, which are not so wide, which have a deep keel and are more in the water than sitting on top of the water, they have a much higher comfort factor. And you can also see on the internet sailboat data, and there you can look at the different boats and you can see the comfort factor in general. And here Predict Wind gives it specifically for different situations. So in most cases, don't be afraid. It's very comfortable sailing. Here we have a wonderful sail in Scotland. Sun is shining and no big waves. And in doubt, any questionable waters or places, well, pass there at slack water, approximately high water or low water. Then there won't be any tidal races. And I think it's also good to be careful and plan for nice weather, or use the comfort factor from Predict Wind. Then you can have a comfortable ride. Of course, you can then also have a current from the side, not only from against you, but from the side. And here on this picture, you can see the green pointing is the heading, and the red dotted line is the course over ground. So we have a current pushing this boat, our boat now southbound. You can see it by the red arrow, the current arrow in the middle there, pushing us southbound. That's why we are heading about 270.9 degrees is the heading, but the course over ground is 258.2. So we have a side current, and to take the side current into consideration is quite helpful. For instance, if you want to cross the English Channel, because on the English Channel, when you cross it from north to south or south to north, you have the current going either to east or to west. Remember from the previous video, when it's flooding, the current is pushing you to the east, and if it's ebbing, it goes back into the Atlantic and it pushes you to the west. But you want to go north-south. So in my example here, I want to go from Lymington, where the boat is there, through the Needles, and go to Cherbourg in the south. So I have two waypoints here. So one waypoint is the start after the Needles, and then down due south to Cherbourg. It's a course of 180 degrees. So you can then do a little overview calculation. That's why I like the chart so much. You can see that it is 60 nautical miles. You have a speed through water of about 6 knots. That's what I assume here. And it takes about 10 hours. If you use electronic means now, so with a plotter counter steers all the time. So using electronics in this case is counterproductive. It is much slower than doing it by hand. And I will show this and illustrate this, because the plotter is always working against the current. So let's assume we have gone to our first waypoint. And now here we experience a current of 2.4 knots pointing westbound. So this means that in 1 hour the current pushes us 2.4 nautical miles to the west. If you're now sailing with a plotter, it will compensate for this. It doesn't know what's happening in the future, but it knows now I'm pushed to the west, so I have to counter that. So I have to have a heading here somewhat east to my line, my course over ground to Cherbourg. So it steers some 170 degrees or something. Well, what happens now is, of course, that we have a lot of other currents. They decrease, and we have to compensate less and less and less. Now we have no current at all. We point exactly south, but then the current goes into the opposite direction, to the east, and the plotter compensates by that and sails to the west. So the plotter now makes sure that the course over ground is exactly south. It keeps a constant course over ground because it doesn't know what we want. It thinks we want to go along that course over ground. And it could be that we want to go along that black line if there are shallows around. But actually, we don't mind if we go a little bit detour to the east or west. We want to get there as fast as possible. And this is not as fast as possible. So instead, if we do it by hand, it is much more effective. So how do we do this by hand? Well, it's easy. You just sum up all the currents that push us to the west, and then you sum up all the currents that pushes us to the east. So in these 10 hours, it pushes us first 7.8 nautical miles to the west, and thereafter 6.7 nautical miles to the east in the 10 hours it takes to go over the English Channel. So to sum up, that means 1.1 mile to the west in these 10 hours. That's not too much, so we don't have to bother too much about counter steering at all. But the 1.1 nautical mile we should consider. So what you do is you take your chart. You first draw the current that will influence you. That's only 1.1 knot or nautical miles in 10 hours in total. So that's why I put that 1.1 nautical mile for these 10 hours. And the next thing is that you prolong this line a little bit because you should not connect those two. Instead, what you do that you measure the speed through water that you do in the 10 hours. So in 10 hours speed through water with 6 knots, that's 60 nautical miles through the water. And you put one of the divider needles where the current arrow ends, and then you look where it crosses the black line. That's why we had to prolong it, right? Because it could be before or after. In this case, it's a bit after. So we make a line there. This is where we get in 10 hours. So this next step is to connect the end of the arrow and where we end up after 10 hours. Not connected to the waypoint. No. Connected to the line where it crosses the course over ground. So this is the course to steer. So if you now measure this with a Portland plotter, you will see that you have a course to steer of 175 degrees. This is what you have to do in total. So what happens now when you sail by hand? That is that we come out here in through the needles, we sail to our waypoint, and then we hold 175 degrees. We make a little detour, it looks. We are first pushed to the west, and then we are pushed back to the east. So, but our propulsion is maximized towards France, and we sail the shortest time. So here you can see that it makes a lot of sense to do this by hand. It does actually also help, a little tip here, that you consider the current that you will encounter coming to Cherbourg. So in this case, you will have east-going currents when you approach Cherbourg. So try to stay west of Cherbourg. So that means that if you have to do some corrections, it's much easier to follow the current into the harbor rather than if you by some miscalculations end up east of Cherbourg, then you have to work yourself against the current. So I would put the waypoint actually a little bit to the west of Cherbourg here, so you can then enter Cherbourg with the current. And for the German-speaking watchers here, I have all written this down in my book Fahrtensegeln, Praxisguide Fahrtensegeln, also exactly this example. Now this is when we want to go from one point to the other and we want to do it in a smart way. Then we calculate our course to steer. That's one job. The next situation could be that we need to calculate our estimated position, because sailing from Dunkirk to Dover, so Dunkirk to Dover, Dunkirk is here in France, you pass Calais and you go to Dover, and that's the waypoint. Here is a traffic separation scheme. So the yellow line with the pink borders, that's a traffic separation scheme. So traffic separation scheme, you know certainly that you may only cross in a right angle by heading. So you can't just go from Dunkirk to Dover, you have to cross that in the right angle. So if you do that with a plotter, that is not so practical as you do it by hand. You will see it here. Anyway, so when you go from Dunkirk, you want to go to the west. Dover is to the west of Dunkirk. So what you normally do is that you leave at high water and then you take the ebb. So you leave at high water and then the sail with the ebb. Ebb is taking you out back into the Atlantic. And let's assume you have a speed through water at 5 knots. Okay, so you start off by sailing here and then you have a nice current of 2.4 knots which pushes you wonderfully towards west. You have 5 knots and you get another 2.4 knots as a present. So you do a speed over ground of a wonderful 7.4 knots. And then you reach the traffic separation scheme and you know that here we have to cross by a right angle by heading. So there's nothing to discuss. To follow the call regs, you need to cross the traffic separation scheme in 90 degrees heading. So now the current has increased a bit because you started at the high water and now the current has increased. Actually, the current also increases in the middle of the English Channel. So that is 3.1 knots I have here as an example. That pushes you quite considerably to the side. So this is about 10 nautical miles. So that's about 2 hours worth of sailing with 5 knots. So after the 3.1 knots, you have a 2.9 knots here in my example, and it pushes you over here much more than you wanted to. And your speed is mathematically calculated 5.8 knots, so you still have some current pushing you forward, but also sideways. And that's not what you intended to do, because coming now, starting here you have the freedom to change the course according to your desire. And now with the 2.1 knots of speed, because you're now closer to land, it's a bit less. Now you have to work against you. So now that means that if you have 5 knots through water and 2.5 or 2.1 against you, that's about 3.3 knots over ground only that you do here sideways. So it takes a long time to get to Dover. So let's see how we can do this in a much smarter way. So what we know is that if we put a waypoint here instead, and we then take a heading of 90 degrees here, and then calculate these 2 hours and check where we end up. 2 hours we go through water, and then we have 2 hours worth of current. So that's first 3.1 nautical miles in the first hour, 2.9 nautical miles in the second hour. We can pre-calculate by hand that we arrive approximately here. Over ground we will go this route, but the calculation puts us into this position where we end the traffic separation scheme. We still have the same speed here actually over ground, and then from here it is wonderful because you continue with the same heading, continue with the same speed into Dover. So if you do some passage planning here, you can save a lot of time and have the rewarding feeling that you have done it right, playing the tides. And again, for the German-speaking people, I have all written this in my book, Praxisguide Fahrtensegeln. This example, if you want to read it again in German. And also I have a video on my website comparing different kinds of paper charts, if you want to see that.